A Roman legion. So iconic is this term that the mere mention of it will give people an image of centurions and legionaries in their lorica segmentata, throwing pilums and fighting with their gladius in cohort formations side by side against the barbarians of the earth. The legions of Rome gave rise to an empire, maybe the most important one in human history. But the legions of that mighty state had many variations, some far from the iconic ones during the height of the imperial period. To understand the Roman legions, one has to have knowledge about its humble but at the same time chaotic beginnings. This legion, that would later develop into the almost unstoppable war machine we all love and respect, looked very different in its early form than what most people would picture it to be. Ancient Italy before Rome was a land of many tribes and clans. Etruscans, Sabines, Oscans, Latins, and of course the Romans themselves existed under a constant state of pressure from each other. Raiding parties roamed the highlands and mountains, picking off poorly secured settlements. In these chaotic situations, the Romans had to farm, build, and most importantly survive. Rome at this stage was just a small settlement beside the Tiber River. If you want to know a more in-depth explanation of Rome and its first king Romulus, you can watch my earlier video on the subject. In this video we will go into how Romulus, or rather how the Romans, conducted themselves in this tribal state and how they viewed warfare. To begin, we must describe what a tribe is. A tribe or a clan is a collection of people, often by blood relations, that would exist as a group. The clans of Italy would often have their own settlement, where they would farm and build, but they would also form war bands to go out and take from others what they wanted to gain for themselves. A clan would always have a clan chieftain, most often the most famed man in the clan. To gain leadership, one had to be strong, have courage, and be charismatic. But if the chieftain failed to provide for his followers, he could just as fast as he had gained the position, lose it. To keep the other men of the clan content, the chieftain sought to enrich them. This was most often done by raids and ransackings of neighboring tribes and communities. Sometimes different clans would cooperate, only to later find each other as enemies again. In this world, there were no constants. You always had to be on your guard. Because of the clan chieftain's precarious position, he would often embellish his stories of conquest and acts of valor. Bards would immortalize him through songs and stories, which would trickle down through the generations. The clan warfare itself was often chaotic, where once one set of tactics had worked, they would fail the second try. Most often, strength in numbers or a surprise attack would lead to victory, and the clan chieftain who had worked the most on embellishing his stories would most often have the numbers on his side. Most often, raiding parties would attack a lightly defended settlement to take as much as they could carry back home, but when a pitched battle actually happened, it would almost always degenerate into groups of men killing each other in their own small single combats. Single combat itself was not something rare. Clan leaders could and would formally arrange fights between each other, often to the death. This type of fighting was seen as something correct and consecrated, which would lead to increased fame and valor on the victor's side. The only constant, though, in this early development of warfare between different tribes was that where a victory had been gained, looting would always follow. After winning a battle or raiding a settlement, men, women, and children of the losing side would be taken as slaves or be killed. Livestock and crops would be stolen. Weapons and armors would be picked from the dead soldiers, and whatever else could be scavenged would be taken back to the victor's settlement. It was now up to the chieftain to split up the spoil between his men. Pillaging was the very substance of the war, so the warriors of the winning side saw it as their right to receive parts of the plunder. Just as how the chieftain kept his men in line with his fame and strength, he gave out the spoils of war to keep them content with his leadership. The normal clan warrior would not be able to afford anything too fancy in the form of protection or weaponry. But what we do know is that most men would be equipped with 2 spears, the shafts being made from wood and the tip being either of iron or bronze. The spears would have leaf-shaped blades and sometimes be decorated with different patterns. Swords have also been found in archaeological sites, but they seem to not have been nearly as common as the spears, because of the high cost of manufacturing one. In warrior burials on the Esquiline Hill in Rome, a short sword about 44 centimeters and a long sword about 70 centimeters have been recovered. The blades were mostly of bronze, but iron ones have also been found from this period. The armor of an early clan warrior in Italy is nothing to brag about. Most men would have the Italian scutum shield. The scutum was a broad rectangular shield that would cover a man fully if he was crouching. It would have a wooden spine with a metal plate in the middle and a single hand grip for the warrior to hold on to. Other than a shield, some men, if they could afford it, or maybe if they were lucky enough to loot one, would be equipped with a helmet. Different types of helmets have been found around early Rome. Most of them are of the calotte type. Other examples would be wickerwork reinforced with metal plates. Although the most common head protection was probably a simple skull cap made from boiled leather. The most common type of protection for the body would be the pectoral. The pectoral was the breastplate with a rectangular shape. It was somewhat under 20 centimeters in width and somewhat over 20 centimeters long. It also had incurving sides to fit the breast better. The pectoral would be fitted with leather straps that pierced the corners of the breastplate to hold it together. This piece of armor is often found to have been decorated with different forms and shapes, often with 5 bosses, 1 in each corner and 1 in the center. If we instead look at the equipment of richer men, the clan leaders and their most entrusted warriors, you would be quick to see a difference from the normal clansmen. A chieftain would almost always carry a sword, mostly of the Antennae type, named after their ornamental spiral horns. The sword was seen as a badge of authority. It displayed the chieftain's courage and power. The clan leaders would also carry a spear, but probably of a more expensive type made from rarer materials than the normal warrior. He would be equipped with a shield, but instead of the scutum, he may have gotten his hands on a round Etruscan style, made completely from bronze. His helmet and armor were made from shining bronze, decorated with embossing. Some examples would be the Villanovan helmet or the Greek poncho type cuirass. Richer men, if they could, would also acquire greaves for protection against blows aimed at the legs. Greaves would become increasingly popular and cheaper as the years went on. All of this equipment was up for grabs when a battle had been fought and the looting commenced. In this tribal warfare, there was no standardization of weaponry or armor, no cohesive battle lines, or no particular rules for what each person's job was in the warband. But it would not take long for Rome, as the legend tells us during their first king, to bring some structure to the warbands of central Italy. Romulus, the first king of Rome, who reigned between 753 to 716 BC, is credited for creating and establishing the first Roman legion. To understand the first Roman legion, we must understand how the clans in that society gathered and mustered for war. Romulus created 3 tribes after his war with the Sabines. These tribes were the Ramnes, Titiers, and Luceres. Some evidence points to that they each contained the Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan citizens of Rome. Inside each of these tribes there would exist many gentes, or other words, clans. One gente was essentially a big family. It would be connected by blood or marriage, and they all contained a clan leader or family head. When the king gave the command, these clan leaders would muster their men and join into the greater legion. We can see a shift here that the families or clans muster not because of their own benefit, but instead because their society and king calls them to do it. In other words, this new mustering was held together by social obligation and for the betterment of society. Above the gentes or clans, you had the curia, meaning assembly of armed men. One curia contained 100 fighting men and could contain many gentes depending on how many men could be mustered by each family head. 10 of these curia would form a tribe. In other words, one tribe contained 1,000 fighting men. Each tribe would be commanded by a tribunus militum, and he was responsible to keep the tribe at full capacity in the times of war. When the three tribes were gathered, it formed the Roman legion, ultimately containing 3,000 men. The equites, or cavalry of this early legion, is drenched in uncertainty. Some sources point to there having been 100 horsemen from each tribe that would form the cavalry of the army. There are also legends about the 300 celeres, meaning the swift, a bodyguard of cavalry formed by and protected Romulus himself. What is more probable is that these so-called horsemen were in fact the veterans, elite or rich soldiers that would ride to battle but then dismount when they were needed to join the fray. This was the case of the early Greek counterpart, the hippeis. Excluding the normal legion, there also existed the warrior priests of the colleges, of the Sali. The cult of the Sali were worshippers of Mars, the god of war. It is believed that this college was created after Latin and Sabine cultural elements mixed in the early stages of the Roman city. If we incorporate legends, we can make the assumption that they would have been established after the famous rape of the Sabine women and the consequent war. The college would consist of 12 life members from patrician families. This rare membership would have been seen as a very prestigious one, which is why only the richest men in Rome would be able to afford it. We here notice the beginning of religious matters being patrician-led, something that would become the status quo until the establishment of Christianity in the empire almost 1,000 years later. The leader of the Sali college would be a magister, the term being of military origin. The warriors would wear decorated tunics in various colors with the bronze square pectoral mentioned earlier on their chest. They would also be equipped with bronze belts and silver helmets called apex. For weaponry, short daggers and in some accounts short spears or staffs would be carried. But the most distinctive item associated with these warrior priests would be the ansil. The ansil was an oval shield of bronze that would be indented at the top and bottom with decorations on the outside. The College of the Sali did not only establish that the religious matters would be heavily patrician favored, but also the strong connection between religions and military matter. Romans were spiritual and God-fearing people. If the omens had a negative outlook, it could divert them from going to war. That one of the first, if not the first college in Rome would be towards the worship of Mars, evidently tells us the importance of religion in Roman foreign matters. The early development of Roman tactics also saw the development of leadership. I have already described how a tribunus militum would hold command over a tribe, but it looks like this was more of a command to assemble and get the tribes to its full capacity in the times of need. On the battlefield, we see the early roots of the Roman centurion being established around this time. According to the historian Johannes Lydus, who himself quotes from the lost manual written by Paternus, Romulus was the first man who would appoint a centurion for his army. Each curiae of 100 men would be given its own centurion. There would be altogether 30 centurions in the legion, which fits with the 30 curiae. We see similar army compositions in Greece around this time, with groups of 100 men each having a leader that was called a hekatontarches. The equipment of the centurions would probably have been the most valuable and sturdy a man could afford. The men who were appointed centurions would have been from the higher echelons of power and wealth. He would have a sword, most likely a more valuable spear than the common soldier, a shield in either the round Etruscan style or the more common scrutum. The armor of the centurion could have in some cases been the poncho type muscle cuirass, bronze greaves for further leg protection, and maybe a Villanovan helmet. There are historic finds of bronze masks that are embroidered and detailed. This would have been a more expensive type of equipment, but would show the centurion's rank and wealth for all else to see. There are not many sources or evidence for centurions in the early Roman kingdom. Maybe they were not even called centurions, but there is enough evidence to support the theory of this style of early leadership being implemented during the period. As the Romans fought up and started using more tactics in their warfare, they would have needed officers on the ground to lead smaller detachments of men, and this would have been the duty of the centurion. After Romulus had established his city, created his governmental body, and formed his new legion, Rome was involved in a number of wars against the surrounding city-states. To win these wars, the Romans had to start thinking with a strategic mindset. What we see from findings and read about in ancient sources is a new form of city-state warfare taking place in central Italy. Romulus with his army started conquering new lands and villages. Instead of raiding a target and then fast leaving for home with the loot, we see a permanent establishment of Roman forces and a power in these newly conquered surrounding areas. If the Romans did not outright annex a conquered village or tribe, they would force what they called an alliance upon them. This meant that in future wars, these vassals or allies of Rome had to help by sending men and resources to bolster the Roman military machine. Rome would also often establish colonies in newly conquered areas, or turn conquered villages into Roman colonies. A colony would be a place where Romans were encouraged to move, which would extend their area of influence in central Italy. Rome with Romulus as its king would start a series of expansions, which successive rulers would continue. After time, it would establish the Roman name as a dominant force in central Italy. Many factors contributed to Rome's expansion, but it cannot be underestimated how the Roman war machine was and would continue to be extremely important in the development of the kingdom and the later republic. What we have gone over in this video is just a humble but violent start of this machine of war. An important inroad into the early development of the internal city's march for greatness.